we are seeing an imbalance of the supply and demand in the United States, and primarily perhaps caused by the pandemic, contributing to a higher inflation rate. What's out there for the White House to consider to balance controlling the inflation and competing with China at the same time?
At this point, I don't see a great deal that the Biden administration can do that would ease inflation in the short term. I think that the only part of the U.S. government that can cool inflation off right now would be the Federal Reserve. The problem there, of course, is that if the central bank decides to tighten monetary policy very dramatically, or at least enough to bring inflation rates down substantially, it runs a very great risk of throwing the economy into a pretty serious recession. And that would be an extremely controversial move, not only because of the economic impact, it would be an extremely controversial move because it would come during an election year.
Many people in the United States believe that former President Trump's trade war has been so far proved to be a very blunt weapon that didn't hurt China much. Instead, it hurt U.S. consumers more. Do you agree?
Now, if the kinds of tariffs that President Trump imposed on so many Chinese products were meaningfully fueling those inflation rates, you would think the inflation rates would have been much higher. In fact, they were barely at the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. So again, I see no evidence whatever that tariffs on Chinese products hurt U.S. consumers. You could argue, by the way, that inflation would have been even lower in that case, but very, very low inflation, that kind of very low inflation is never good for the economy. So again, there are no doubt many Americans who will never say any kind word about President Trump or any of his policies, but it's clear to me that the so-called trade war that he conducted against China was a very significant success, mainly in greatly accelerating a U.S. decoupling from China economically. Not a total divorce, again, that's not realistic for many, many years, but decoupling advanced very substantially.
Would you say that now President Biden already has a comprehensive strategy for trade policies with China? What could be there at the top of his agenda to do things in this regard?
I don't foresee the president taking very dramatic actions against China on the trade front for the time being, mainly because those wide-ranging tariffs, which in some cases are at the level of 25%, they're in place already. They cover about $350 billion worth of Chinese exports, goods exports, to the United States each year. That's out of a total of maybe 450 or 500 billion. So most Chinese exports are already covered. The one area where I think that we could see some meaningful action by President Biden would involve new sanctions on Chinese technology entities. And they would be imposed mainly on national security grounds. There is always, of course, a real possibility of much more significant sanctions if the United States government determines that China is providing Russia with major support for its Ukraine war. At this point, the administration doesn't seem to be willing to reach that conclusion, but the possibility is certainly there.
Regarding the tariffs imposed on China during the trade war, do you think we should expand exclusions on more products from China in order to boost domestic consumption and economic growth?
I would greatly prefer that further exclusions be very sharply limited. However, it's very difficult for any individual to know the situation in every single manufacturing industry that relies on Chinese parts, Chinese components, Chinese materials like plastics, for example. So I certainly would not rule out the idea that there are some industries and some companies that really need further exclusions from President Trump's tariffs because alternative supplies of those inputs simply are not available, or they're not available at the kind of price that would make manufacturing the final product profitable. So again, I think this is largely a judgment call. I've actually expressed some major concerns that the exclusion process may go too far, and in fact, that the administration might use it as a sneaky way to lift tariffs, and in fact, to lift many tariffs, way too many tariffs. That hasn't happened so far, and I don't see many signs that that's likely to happen anytime soon. If only because in an election year, the president is going to want to go to great lengths to avoid the appearance of seeming soft on China.
Talking about domestic manufacturing and at the same time, keeping in mind the competition with China, what kind of things U.S. should do and what kind of things U.S. shouldn't do?
On the trade front as such, I think that there's ample room to raise tariffs on Chinese products further. One major result of that Trump trade war has been to persuade many companies, not only U.S.-owned companies, but many foreign-owned companies, to leave China and go to other low-cost countries like Vietnam, like Thailand, in some cases, Western Hemisphere countries like Mexico and the Central American countries, to try to escape those tariffs. In a much smaller number of cases, companies that have been producing in China have brought their operations back to the United States. As far as I'm concerned, that's the best possible outcome. But even when companies leave China for third countries, to me, that's good for U.S. interest because the United States, for better or worse, is in a zero-sum conflict with China. Anything that weakens China benefits the United States. So I think that that higher tariffs on Chinese products would incentivize more companies to move their factories from China to various other countries. I do think that even though the short-term impact would be small, it is very important for the United States government to increase its financial support for research and development, both your so-called basic research, which tries to advance scientific frontiers, and more practical so-called applied research, which actually tries to take these breakthroughs and figure out how to use them in actual products and services. There's certainly legislation that Congress is presently considering on that score, particularly concerning semiconductors, which of course have attracted a lot of attention because they're so vitally important strategically and they're vitally important economically too. That legislation, though, was originally introduced in June of 2020 and still has not reached President Biden's desk. And there are some pretty substantial disagreements that the House of Representatives and Senate need to reconcile before that legislation can become law. So we're still not nearly where we need to be as a country in providing support for critical industries like semiconductors.